Hello and welcome to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi and I'm the principal attorney at the firm. Today's review, we're going to be looking at a privacy policy. So let's take a look. One thing that I used to do in the past is I used to look at products and services, but my reviews are looking at foundational privacy principles that traditionally will apply to every single business. And then I can also use my expertise to form some type of opinions when I review these, because one of the things I do for a living is I draft these for companies. I draft the privacy policies, I draft the privacy notices, I draft the cookie notices, I provide legal expertise on cookie consent management and how the flow should be like. And it's very tailored to how the organization operates. Now, when I do these reviews on YouTube, there's a lot of details that are missing from these businesses. I don't have insight knowledge that I traditionally need in order to draft these types of notices and policies for clients. I have an intake form within the firm that I distribute to clients in order to be able to draft this. So there's many details that are always missing from these reviews. However, I still think it's valuable to take a look at what the privacy landscape is for organizations operating in 2026. And if you have any interest in any of the other reviews, I have plenty of videos on this channel. Today, we're going to be looking at this company, Netapp. So already at the top, I'm seeing something related to storage, data services, and solutions. And we've got our favorite word of 2026, artificial intelligence. Now, I've done reviews on artificial intelligence. If you care to look at them, they're on this channel. The relationship between artificial intelligence and privacy is that in many cases, most of the AI tools that I either know of or have seen process personal data in some capacity. So there are additional considerations when introducing an artificial intelligence tool. Now, this review is not about AI. Take a look at other videos that I've done about artificial intelligence. But it's very interesting to see how the privacy landscape, even just a year ago, many organizations weren't talking about artificial intelligence on their public-facing websites. And I have lots of videos from 2025 if you want to see those. But now it's becoming more and more common to see artificial intelligence crop up in some capacity for organizations. So it's definitely a consideration. I can provide an opinion of where I see things going in the future. I think it's going to become more and more common for businesses to not only have a privacy notice on their sites, but they're also going to start having an artificial intelligence notice too, because from a transparency perspective, if an AI tool or product is going to process personal data, businesses have an obligation to be transparent. So let's keep looking at this. I always tweak my settings and opt out every time I do these. All right, so one of the first things that I always look at is I try and identify what the scope of the notice is. Now, let me talk a little bit about this. It's very important for businesses to identify scope because there's a lot of personal data that gets processed within an organization. There is the personal data that an organization is processing related to their customers. There is personal data they are processing related to their employees. There is personal data that is processed for prospective employees. There's personal data that is processed for vendors and partners, right? Each of these groups of individuals, they have certain data that is being obtained by an organization. And so when you're drafting a privacy notice, you have to think very carefully about, one, who's the audience? What is the tone for this notice? And what type of personal data are we processing on this group? And what are our obligations under the law? So something that I can say as an example, generally for an employee, you're probably going to obtain their social security number. Now, for anybody that's international, that is an identifier that is used for many different purposes, but it's considered sensitive in the United States. The privacy notice you're going to draft for your employees when you process their social security number is going to be very different to the privacy notice you draft for a customer, because you're not going to be in most cases collecting the social security number of your customers. So your obligations under the data protection laws are going to be a little bit different. And that is why the purpose of scope in a privacy notice or policy is very important. And it's one of the first things that I address. The second thing I want to talk about that is highly important is the mention of who the data controller is. Now, why is this important? There's many reasons it's important to distribute this on a privacy notice, but the main reason I'll say is there are a lot of responsibilities that a company accrues when they choose to process personal information. One of such responsibilities is something called a data subject access request. So one of the responsibilities a data controller has to fulfill is if a consumer wants to find out information about how a company has processed their personal data, they have the opportunity, based on their data protection rights, to reach out to that company to find out how that data has been used. Now, every geography has different rights for its consumers, so it's really important to review what your rights are as a consumer. And then also on the business side, the data controller side, the data controller needs to figure out what responsibilities do I have when it comes to fulfilling those rights, because many geographies have a specific deadline for fulfilling those rights in a particular time frame. Now, let me talk about myself. I am a consumer of this website. Why? Because I've landed on it. So in that respect, I have rights. Now you can see here, you can contact the Netapp privacy legal team. If I was to reach out to them and say, hey, I visited your website, I want to know what type of data that you have obtained as I interacted with your site, they would have an obligation under the data protection law to fulfill that. And that is why it's so important to detail who the data controller is. And I see this missing on some privacy notices that I've done reviews on for this channel. And I think it's a very important piece of this, because with much data comes much responsibility, right? You cannot just process personal data because there are laws that dictate how it can be done. Okay, let's keep going. I really like the fact that the scope appears at the top here. And I also really like that they've identified geographies, because many of the privacy reviews I've done do not. And now I can start to think about different concepts and provisions within this privacy review that hinge upon the data protection laws that are in place in the European Economic Area, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. So, okay, this is fantastic. At the beginning of this review, I talked about the different groups of individuals, and we can see here that they also have a specific privacy policy associated with job candidates. So this particular privacy policy addresses their role as a data controller, which I had already mentioned, and it applies to personal information processed by Netapp for purposes determined by Netapp and explained in this policy. And I presume that includes the website. Now, we haven't reviewed everything, but I presume that this privacy policy is for website usage. Now, we could probably identify that later. I'm definitely not going to do that today. But I think there's so much that goes into drafting these, and also considerations that a business has when it's trying to be transparent about its privacy practices. But I highlighted this because we think about privacy on many different facets. We think about it from a geographical perspective. We think about it from a data subject perspective, and data subject just means synonymous to individual. We think about this based on different definitions under the data protection law. What is considered sensitive in one country may not be considered sensitive in another country. Yeah, that's what I want to say. We've only had the chance to go through 2 of these provisions, but if you like this type of content, I create a video doing my reviews, and I've done many other organizations, and I look at different provisions. So if you liked this content, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in another review.